The rail went first, a single crack like a green branch snapping underfoot, sharp enough to carry across 60 yards of wet grass and through the fogged window of a pickup idling near the gate. A truck slows every morning at the same gate and never turns in, and the stable hands have started making bets about why. This morning it had stopped instead, engine ticking, and the man behind the wheel had gotten out. "There's a vagrant in the north pasture," said Meredith Aldous, the young stable coordinator, into her radio, her voice pitched for efficiency rather than alarm. "Get him off the property before the board gets here." She was 26 and new enough to the job that she still said the board the way some people say church, with a small hitch of reverence. She had not yet learned to look twice at anything. From where she stood on the gravel apron outside the main barn, the man in the north pasture was exactly what her radio call made him, a shape in a faded coat, motionless at the fence line, cap pulled low against a sun that had not yet cleared the tree line. Trespasser. Loiterer. Someone's grandfather wandered off from someplace he ought to have been kept. She did not yet know his name was Lester Dunbar, that he was 79 years old, that he had driven the county road at this same hour for longer than she had been alive. She did not know the horse she saw. Everyone on the property saw the horse, because the horse was the reason the second rail went, and then the post beneath it. 24 years of muscle and old cavalry blood coming off its back haunches, with a violence that looked, for one full second, like something had gone wrong rather than something had finally gone right. Bishop crossed the north pasture at a dead run, ears pinned flat, the broken rail still swinging from a splinter of wood, and staff came out of the tack room and the office in the wash bay to see a 1,200-pound gelding bearing down on an old man who had not moved, had not raised a hand, had not so much as flinched. "Sir, step back from the fence," someone was shouting uselessly from 40 yards off. If you've ever been looked past by someone holding a clipboard in a confidence you couldn't argue with, type steady in the comments. Lester did not step back. He turned his right hand palm up, the old tremor in it visible even at that distance, a small, persistent shake that had lived in his fingers for 6 years now and answered to nothing. No rest, no pills, no prayer, until the moment Bishop's head came down into his open palm and the shaking simply stopped, the way a held breath stops once it is finally let out. The horse did not slow so much as arrive, the whole run collapsing into stillness at the last 3 feet, nose to sternum, a sound coming up out of Bishop's chest that was not a whinny and was not a scream, but something older than both, something that had been waiting 19 days to be let out. Meredith Aldous lowered her radio. She did not call off the order. She simply forgot for the length of that sound that she had given it. The kettle went on the same way it always had, the same low click of the burner catching, the same particular whistle it had carried for 31 years, a thin 2-note complaint that Lester Dunbar could have picked out of 100 kettles blind. He set 2 cups down out of habit before he remembered most mornings that only one would be used, and some mornings he did not catch the habit in time and simply left the second cup standing empty on the counter until the coffee in it went cold and he poured it out into the sink without comment. Alma's reading glasses sat on the kitchen windowsill, where they had sat for 11 years, one arm slightly bent, the lenses dusted every Sunday whether they needed it or not. He did not wear them. He did not read with them. He dusted them because his hands needed something small and certain to do on Sunday mornings, and because a woman who had spent 46 years correcting his grammar and his temper and the crookedness of his fence posts deserved a windowsill kept clean in her name. He hummed while he dusted them, low, almost under the breath, 4 bars of a hymn called "Come Thou Fount," that she used to hum bent over her tomato steaks in July, and he did not always finish the verse. Some mornings his voice caught on the same line it always caught on, and he let it go rather than force it. The barn smelled of dry hay and neat's foot oil and, faintly, of the horse liniment he had not needed in years but kept on the shelf anyway, out of the same instinct that kept Alma's glasses dusted. On a nail just inside the door hung a halter, hand-stitched, the leather gone the color of strong tea and cracked along both cheek pieces, its brass nameplate rubbed down to a dull, nameless shine by 4 decades of his own thumb passing over it without ever quite reading what it said. He had made that halter with an awl and a spool of waxed thread the winter he was 39, for a bay colt with a crooked star on its forehead and more nerve than sense, and he had not touched the horse it was made for in 40 years, and he had not thrown the halter away in 40 years either, which was its own kind of confession if anyone had thought to ask him what it confessed. No one asked. That was, in its way, the arrangement he had made with the world, and he had kept his end of it faithfully. Every morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge behind Millhaven Creek, Lester took the county road the long way into town, past the white plank fencing and the carved wooden sign that read, Millhaven Creek Heritage Stables, in letters gone soft at the edges from 20 winters of repainting. He slowed at the gate the way another man might slow at a church he no longer attended. He never turned in. He idled there long enough to see whether the north pasture gate was latched, long enough to see a bay shape moving or not moving near the tree line. And then he drove on and bought his coffee at the counter in town, and came home and put the kettle on and dusted a dead woman's glasses, and never once in 4 years of these mornings told a single soul in Millhaven Creek why. The stable hands had noticed the truck by now. They had started laying bets on it the way young people lay bets on anything they cannot explain and do not think worth asking about directly. Some said he was casing the property, some said he was a bird watcher, one said, not unkindly, that he was probably just old and lost. None of them had considered that a man might return to the edge of something every day for 4 years, not because he had misplaced his way, but because he remembered it exactly, down to the yard. Tanner Wycliffe stood in front of the Heritage Stables board with the easy posture of a man who had never once doubted a slide before he built it, tablet raised at chest height, a stylus tapping the glass twice in a small ritual gesture, as if consulting some invisible colleague for permission before he spoke a verdict he had already decided. The data is clear, he said, and the room, 7 board members and a scattering of staff arranged on folding chairs in the equipment barn's meeting corner, leaned in the way rooms lean in for people who sound certain. Cortisol proxy markers derived from Bishop's movement patterns, heart rate variability logged over the last 6 weeks, appetite decline, social withdrawal from herd contact. This isn't sentiment. This is 22 data points converging on one conclusion. He was 34, square-shouldered, dressed in a fitted quarter zip with his firm's insignia stitched small over the heart, and he was, by any honest account, good at this. His command of the numbers was real, his read of the graphs fluent, his sympathy for the animal, in that moment, not performed. Bishop is a 24-year-old gelding showing textbook signs of terminal decline consistent with grief pattern shutdown. Relocation to a specialized equine hospice facility isn't just recommended. At this stage, keeping him here without proper palliative infrastructure borders on negligent. A board member near the back, a retired schoolteacher named Constance Radcliffe, asked whether hospice meant recovery. Hospice means comfort, Wycliffe said gently, the way a man says a hard thing he has said many times before and no longer feels the weight of. It means we stop asking him to be something he can't be anymore. It was, on its own terms, a competent presentation, delivered by a man who had genuinely done the reading, and 3 of the 7 board members were already nodding before he finished. He might have kept nodding heads all morning if a call had not come in on the radio clipped to the barn manager's belt, low and businesslike. Movement at the north fence, an unfamiliar man on foot near the pasture line. That was where Sloane Aldridge, 24 years old, 6 months into the only job she had ever wanted, was standing when 2 of the maintenance staff walked a stooped man in a faded barn coat past the wash bay and out toward the front gate, one hand loosely at his elbow, not rough, just final, the way you walk out. Someone you have already decided does not need explaining. "Sir, this is private property," the taller of the 2 men was saying. "You can't be back there unsupervised." The old man did not argue. He let himself be walked, his pale eyes tracking once, briefly, toward the north pasture and the bay horse standing at the tree line with its ears already turned, before he was steered past the office and toward the gravel lot where his truck sat idling. Sloane had been sweeping the aisle outside the tack room, and she stopped sweeping. She did not know why. She would not have been able to say, if Wycliffe himself had asked her, what it was about the set of that man's shoulders or the economy of his walking, unhurried even while being hurried, that made her stand a moment longer than the scene required. She only knew that somewhere behind her, in the meeting corner, a consultant with a tablet was explaining Bishop's decline in the language of proxies and markers, And out here, a stranger nobody had bothered to ask a single question was being removed from the one place the horse's ears kept turning toward. And something about the arithmetic of that did not sit easy in her, though she could not yet have shown her work. He came back on a Tuesday, 4 days after the first removal, parking his truck in the same gravel turnout and walking to the same stretch of fence as though the order to leave had been a suggestion rather than a rule. Tanner Wycliffe saw him from the meeting corner and crossed the yard himself this time, tablet under one arm, the posture of a man handling an irritation personally so it would not require handling twice. "You're back," Wycliffe said. It was not a question. "Look, I don't know what your interest is here, but this isn't a petting zoo, and it isn't a place for folk remedies. We have a clinical protocol in progress. Whatever you think you're going to do, hum at him, feed him something out of your pocket. It isn't going to override 6 weeks of documented data." A handful of stable hands had drifted close enough to listen, the way people gather at the edge of any exchange that promises a small public correction. Somebody laughed, not unkindly, more the reflex laugh of a crowd waiting to see which way a thing will fall. Lester did not answer right away. He looked past Wycliffe toward the pasture, where Bishop stood with his head low and his weight canted off his left hind leg, the posture of an animal that has stopped expecting anything to change. "He's not declining," Lester said finally. "He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Wycliffe said, with the small smile of a man repeating a child's answer back to a room for effect. "Someone he already knows." Wycliffe tapped his tablet twice, out of habit rather than need, and did not look down at it. "That's not a diagnosis. That's a guess dressed up as intuition." "It's not a guess," Lester said. "I've seen that stand before. Weight off the hind leg, head canted toward the gate he can't reach. Horse isn't dying. He's grieving something specific, and grief has a shape same as a hoofprint does if a man spent long enough looking at both." It was, by the room's count, the longest thing anyone had heard him say, and he said it the way a man reads a gauge rather than the way a man pleads a case, 3 sentences and no more, and then he went quiet again, watching the horse rather than the crowd. "Folk wisdom," Wycliffe said, mostly to the staff now, playing to the gallery a little, "is a lovely thing at a fireside. It is not a substitute for instrumentation." A few of the younger hands laughed again, a little louder this time, and someone made a crack about horse whispers that did not quite land, and the crowd began to drift back toward the barn, the show apparently over. Sloane did not drift. She had noticed 3 days running now a small thing she had not yet said aloud to anyone, because it sounded foolish, stated plainly. Bishop's ears turned toward the gate before the old man's truck ever came into view, before the engine note was audible to her own younger ears, as though the horse were reading some frequency in the gravel itself. She had timed it on the second morning, out of a scientist's habit rather than a believer's, and the ears had turned 11 full seconds before she herself first heard the engine. She had written the number down in the margin of her own clipboard, and then, for reasons she could not fully account for, torn the corner off rather than let anyone see it. She watched Lester Dunbar walk back to his truck, unhurried, his shadow long in the early light, and she watched Bishop's head lift to follow him the entire distance to the gate, and she thought, without yet knowing why the thought mattered, he already knows something the tablet doesn't have a field for. 9 minutes after the truck's engine faded down the county road, she went back to sweeping and said nothing to anyone and kept the number folded in her pocket like a debt she intended to collect on later. It happened on a Thursday morning, 53 minutes into a scheduled board walkthrough, with Wycliffe midway through a second presentation meant to close the question before the Friday vote. He had the tablet raised again, citing a fresh overnight reading when the sound came from the north pasture. Not the low crack of a single rail this time, but a full splintering groan, wood tearing from post, as Bishop threw his weight into the top board with both forelegs and came through it at a dead run. The whole meeting corner turned as one body, 7 board members, a dozen staff, Wycliffe himself, tablet still raised, his sentence dying, half-finished in his mouth. Lester had not been near the fence that morning at all. He was standing by his truck at the far turnout, cap in hand, having only just arrived, and Bishop crossed 60 yards of open pasture in the time it took the crowd to draw one collective breath, ears pinned, the broken rail bouncing once against a fence post and going still. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody, this time, called it an emergency. Bishop slowed only in the final stride, The way a man slows only at a threshold he has waited a long time to cross, and brought his head down hard into Lester's chest, nearly staggering the old man backward, and held there, breathing in long, shuddering pulls. His whole body pressed the length of the fence line he had just destroyed to reach one specific person out of everyone who had ever stood on that ground. Wycliffe's tablet chimed, a small clinical alarm meant to flag a spike in heart rate as distress, and nobody looked at it. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight, the particular weight of 40 or 50 people realizing at the same instant that they had misjudged something, and did not yet have the words to say how. Lester's hand came up, the old tremor visible for 1/2 second against the horse's neck, and then stilled completely the moment his palm made contact, the way it always had, the way it had that first dawn at the fence 4 years ago, and every dawn he had driven past and not turned in. "Bishop," he said. Just the name. Nothing more. It was the only word he had brought with him, and it was enough to make Constance Radcliffe, 71 years old and not given to displays, put a hand flat over her own mouth. Sloane stood at the edge of the gathered staff with the torn corner of her clipboard note still folded in her coat pocket, and thought of the 11 seconds, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had been counting the wrong kind of proof the whole time. The board meeting that convened that same afternoon was shorter than anyone expected, and answered nothing that mattered. Transport was confirmed for Friday, noon, a flatbed and trailer already scheduled out of a facility 2 counties over, the paperwork filed under routine relocation in language so mild it made the whole matter sound like a change of address, rather than a decision about whether Bishop would ever stand in this pasture again. The vote to finalize would happen at the same hour. Once the trailer cleared the gate, Board Chair Eleanor Pemberton Hayes explained, not unkindly, reversing course would mean unwinding a contract, a transport fee, and a placement already confirmed at the receiving facility. In practice, once it left, it was final. "The horse belongs to this institution," Wycliffe said, more subdued now than he had been that morning. "And the training record supports my red regardless of what we all just saw. Emotional response isn't the same as medical need." He tapped open the digitized ledger on his tablet, the stable's own archive, scanned years ago from a leather-bound original. The entry for Bishop's training, dated the year the horse was gelded and started under saddle, listed one name as trainer of record, Roland Pemberton, then director of the program, no relation. Board members were quick to clarify, to Eleanor by anything but a coincidence of surname and 40 years of institutional memory. Lester Dunbar appeared nowhere in it. "That's not right," Sloane said before she had fully decided to speak, and the room turned to her the way rooms turn to the newest person in it, faintly surprised she had a voice at all. "I've watched that horse for 6 months. I've watched him for 4 mornings running. Whatever's in that ledger, it isn't watching anything." "Then find something that outweighs a signed institutional record," Wycliffe said, not unkindly, more tired than triumphant, "because sentiment doesn't get a stay of transport." There was, in fact, one document that might have outweighed it, Lester's own handwritten training and farrier log from that year, the daily record of every session he'd ever run with the bay colt who would become Bishop. But that log, staff explained when Sloane asked, had been lost 8 years back in a small electrical fire that took out half the old tack room, the fire that was the reason the current archive existed only as scans and second-hand memory. Whatever had burned that night, everyone assumed, had burned completely. There remained one man alive who might have said otherwise, with any authority the board would honor, Colonel Grover Ledbetter, 81, retired, who had commanded the mounted unit Lester served under decades before any of them were born, and who now sat on the Heritage Stable's own board, a chair currently empty. He was traveling overseas, unreachable by anything but a satellite connection that came and went like weather, and was not due back in the country until Thursday night. The vote was Friday noon. Sloane did the arithmetic twice, hoping it would come out differently the second time, and it did not. She reached him that night, the connection thin and dropping every few words, Colonel Ledbetter's voice arriving in fragments across a satellite delay that made the whole conversation feel like shouting across a canyon. She explained the ledger, the transport, the fence, the name that was not in the record. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that she thought the call had failed entirely. "That halter isn't a keepsake," Ledbetter said finally, his voice cracking faintly on the last word, whether from the connection or something older she could not tell. It's evidence, and it always was. He told her, in pieces interrupted twice by static, that he had pulled a battered logbook out of the tack room himself the night of the fire, on instinct, the way a man grabs one thing without knowing why it matters, and had kept it since in a box of his own effects, unread because reading it had always felt like a debt he wasn't ready to pay. He gave her the box's location, a closet in his home 2 counties away, and a neighbor with a spare key, and asked her, please, to read him the last page over the phone because his eyes weren't what they'd been, and his heart, he said, needed to hear it in her voice rather than his own. She found the book within the hour. The leather cover was warped from heat, but the pages inside were whole, and near the back, in a steady, careful hand, was an entry dated the year Bishop was started under saddle, recording 6 years of daily work with a bay colt, gait corrections, temperament notes, a farrier's careful measurements, and beneath it all, signed plainly, the name Lester Dunbar, trainer. The final entry was dated a week later and read only that he was leaving the program, that the horse was sound and ready, and that he was getting married on the Saturday. Sloane read it all to Ledbetter across the static, and then, because it seemed to matter, brought the book to Lester himself the next morning and read him the training dates aloud while Wycliffe stood nearby, arms crossed, listening despite himself. That first entry, Lester said quietly when she reached it, would be the spring I was 39. He looked toward Wycliffe's tablet, still in the consultant's hand out of habit. Pull up whatever chart you've got on when his trouble started. Wycliffe did, more out of reflex than belief, scrolling back through months of log data to the earliest anomaly his software had ever flagged in Bishop's behavioral baseline, a subtle shift the algorithm had dated with more precision than any human memory could claim. The date on the screen matched, to the week, the date in the log where Lester's handwriting stopped. Wycliffe stared at it a long moment, his thumb hovering over the glass without swiping further. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost the polish it carried in the meeting corner. That's not a coincidence a model accounts for, he said, mostly to himself. My data's right. I had the wrong cause the whole time. He wasn't asking to be let in. He was asking to be let remember. Colonel Grover Ledbetter arrived at the Heritage Stables Thursday night, 9 hours ahead of the vote, in a rental car still smelling of the airport, and crossed the gravel lot toward the barn office without stopping to shake a single hand offered to him along the way. He was 81, silver-haired, still carrying himself with the unhurried economy of a man who had once moved men and horses, both by the force of a lowered voice, and when he found Lester Dunbar standing near the mended stretch of fence, he did not extend a hand at all. He came to attention instead, the full parade posture of a much younger man, boots together, spine straight, and held it a full 3 seconds before he spoke. "Sir," Ledbetter said, and the word cracked clean down the middle on its way out of him. "It is an honor." Nobody in the assembled crowd, the board members drawn out by word of his arrival, the staff who had followed at a respectful distance, Sloane near the fence rail with the burned logbook still under one arm, moved or spoke. Eleanor Pemberton Hayes stood with one hand half raised toward a greeting she did not complete, her mouth open on a word she never finished either. "I owe this man a debt older than most of you," Ledbetter said, to the board now, not to Lester. "And I have carried it unpaid for 40 years out of nothing but my own convenience in not asking after him. In 1967, in a training exercise that went wrong through my own error, I put my mount down on bad ground and broke it, and myself with it. This man reset that horse's leg in a field with a length of fence board and his own belt, and walked me back to the aid station on a leg that had no business holding either of our weight, and never once, in the years since, mentioned it to a soul who might have made something of it for him." He turned finally to Lester. "You could have contested that ledger 40 years ago. Pemberton's name is on that page because he filed the grant paperwork the week you left, and he let the record stand because it built him a career, and you let it stand because you had somewhere better to be." "I had a wedding Saturday," Lester said. "Alma didn't care whose name was on a ledger. I didn't either, much until a horse I loved got put on a truck for the wrong reason." The log's final page was read aloud once more, this time to the full board, in Sloane's steady voice. The 6 years of careful notes, the sound and ready Colt, and beneath it, in the same hand, the plain sentence that he was getting married on the Saturday and would not be back Monday. No anger in it anywhere. No claim. A man closing one ledger of his own accord to open another. "I'm not here to take anything from anybody," Lester said, when the board turned to him for whatever statement they expected a wronged man to make. "Pemberton's dead. Won't do him or me any good to argue with a dead man's paperwork. I'd only ask the records show who actually gentled that horse, so the next person who reads it knows what they're looking at." Wycliffe stepped forward before the board could answer. Tablet finally set down on the fence rail behind him. "Before you vote," he said, "you should know my firm bills per animal for every relocation we manage. I get paid more if he leaves than if he stays. I should have told you that on day one, and I didn't think of it as a conflict until a man in a barn coat showed me my own data meant something I hadn't read right." He looked at Lester. "I owe you an apology I don't fully know how to make." "Don't make it to me," Lester said. "Make it to the next horse whose file crosses your desk. Read the date column before you read the numbers next time. Numbers will tell you what's happening. Won't always tell you why." He held out his hand, not for a shake exactly, but open, the way he'd held it out to Bishop across 60 yards of pasture, and Wycliffe, after a moment, gripped it. The board's vote, when it came at noon on Friday, was not close. Transport was canceled unanimously, the receiving facility notified within the hour, and the ledger amended that same afternoon at Eleanor Pemberton Hayes's own written instruction. Bishop, trained and gentled by Lester Dunbar, 1965 to 1969, record corrected this date, 40 years overdue. Some debts don't come due in court, they come due in a pasture, 40 years late and right on time. 3 weeks later, Lester Dunbar drove through the Heritage Stables gate at dawn the way he always had, except now the gate stood open for him specifically, and Sloane Aldridge, waiting by the north pasture with a lead rope she rarely needed anymore, lifted a hand instead of a radio. Bishop met him at the fence the way he had met him every morning since the vote, unhurried now, no fence left to break, because none of them ever latched that gate against him again. He'd mended the rail himself the same week, with a plank from his own barn and nails he'd carried in his coat pocket for the occasion, and nobody had thought to ask him to. That evening, he stood in his own barn doorway, with the cracked leather halter in both hands, the brass nameplate rubbed nearly smooth by 40 years of his own thumb, and beneath it now, screwed into the wood with 4 small brass screws Sloane had brought him from the hardware store in town, hung a new plate no bigger than a matchbook, engraved plain, Lester Dunbar, Bishop, trainer and friend. He hung the halter back on its nail, the way it had hung for 40 years, and stood a moment with his hand flat against the old leather, the tremor stilling the way it always did at contact with something that had once been alive under his palm. Then, he walked back to the house in the last of the daylight, humming 4 bars of a hymn he never quite finished, and put the kettle on and set out 2 cups from old habit, and did not, this time, pour the second one out.